They always said some men are born into greatness, but the truth they don't tell you is that not every man born with a crown deserves it. Behind the pageantry, behind the ceremonial elegance, behind the gentle bowing and posed photographs, they're live people whose real personalities are hidden under layers of royal varnish. And sometimes peeling back those layers reveals something disturbing, even rotten. This is one of those stories. A story not told by a tabloid gossip columnist or paparazzi chasing headlines, but by someone who stood only steps behind a prince. Someone who poured his bath water, fixed his curtains, and tried in vain to show him decency. Charlotte Briggs, the woman who once thought working for royalty was the highest honor, now speaks openly. And what she reveals changes how we view one of Britain's most controversial royals, Prince Andrew. It's easy to look at Buckingham Palace and assume it's filled with nobility both in blood and in behavior, but Charlotte Briggs tells a different story. She doesn't describe banquet halls filled with grace or a prince who was the people's gentleman. No, what she remembers is a grown man throwing tantrums over misaligned teddy bears, hurling curses at young staff over tiny mistakes, and using power not for responsibility but for humiliation. Briggs was just 21 when she got the job she had dreamed of. Serving in the royal household, what many considered a crowning jewel in a maid's career. But the dream quickly soured. It was the job nobody wanted, she once said. And when the curtains wouldn't fold the way he liked, when a single crease disrupted his royal cocoon of perfection, Prince Andrew didn't just complain, he erupted. Screaming through the halls, swearing at young servants, pounding rage into anything that didn't abide by his invisible rulebook. Picture it. A grown prince whose dignity in public was a polished smile reduced to thundering footsteps and childish tirades when no one else was watching. And maybe that's what makes this story so unsettling, not just behavior unbecoming of a royal, but the sheer contrast between the image he sold and the man he really was. Let's talk about those bears. To any outsider, a man keeping childhood toys might sound quirky, harmless even. But to those forced to serve him, it became a psychological experiment in control. Prince Andrew didn't just keep a few stuffed animals, he curated a garrison. 72 teddy bears, all with assigned positions, flanked by a stuffed black panther and a plush hippo. He demanded they be arranged with what his staff called military precision. There were laminated sheets showing where each one should be placed. 2 bears stood guard by his bed like sentinels. The rest filled shelves, all lined up, counted, guarded, not like toys but relics of some private obsession. Briggs once spent an entire day learning just how the bears were to be arranged. And failure, however small, meant facing an onslaught of royal wrath. It wasn't just the bears. His entire room was treated like a sacred space, with rules few could remember but all were punished for forgetting. Pajamas folded with mathematical symmetry, pillows centered, shoes placed exactly the same way every time. It wasn't cleanliness. It was control. The bedroom wasn't just where Prince Andrew slept. It was his throne room of chaos. And the staff, they were merely subjects expected to orbit around his ego. But perhaps the most chilling part wasn't the tantrums or the teddy bears. It was how calculated the cruelty was. How unnecessary, unprovoked, and relentless it became. Briggs says she spent most days trying not to be seen. That should tell you everything. Imagine working in a palace, a literal monument of power and pride, and still praying to go unnoticed. Not out of humility, but out of fear. Fear that a slammed door, a wrinkled curtain, a misplaced slipper might awaken the version of Andrew that the cameras never captured. Yet while Charlotte was the one speaking, she wasn't the only one suffering. Other staff soon echoed her words. One described being forced to sprint through a room to draw curtains for the Duke while he stood inches away. Another recalled being called incompetent over something as meaningless as the crease on a shirt collar. In each story, a pattern began to emerge. Prince Andrew wasn't miserable because his life was difficult. He made others miserable because he could. And this wasn't behavior born of stress or circumstance. This was a consistent, long-standing pattern, the kind of cruelty that wasn't learned but inherited. Some people grow into monsters. Others were born with fangs hidden behind princely smiles. Staff like Charlotte Briggs didn't just stumble into a nightmare. They walked through the royal gates expecting order, purpose, maybe even respect. But once inside they discovered something entirely different, an environment warped by one man's craving for power and emotional submission. Everyone knew his title, but inside the palace his name carried a different weight. While the world called him His Royal Highness, whispers in staff corridors gave him another name entirely, the Prince of Darkness. It sounds dramatic, doesn't it? Maybe like something out of a novel or a tabloid headline. But the truth is far more chilling than fiction. Because when multiple former employees, all from different backgrounds, different years, different roles, start telling the same story about the same man, it becomes almost impossible to ignore. These weren't tales of an eccentric royal. These were confessions of people worn down emotionally, drained physically, and cornered psychologically by a man wielding his birthright like a weapon. Prince Andrew didn't have the responsibilities that weighed on his older brother Charles. He wasn't second in command, nor did he ever carry the burden of becoming king. Rather, he was the spare, the one allowed to drift just far enough from the spotlight to abuse the shadows. And abuse them he did. Despite holding no real political authority, Andrew demanded a kind of obedience more often seen in dictators than dukes. Everything had to be done his way. Not because it made sense, but because it reminded you who he was and who you weren't. The staff, educated, trained, highly capable individuals, were reduced to acting like medieval servants. One former maid recalled dashing up 7 flights of stairs simply to close a curtain he could have touched himself. Another said they were expected to memorize the placement of his personal items as though training for a museum exhibition. It wasn't just about keeping the room spotless, it was about breaking their will. Rule by micromanagement. Reign by humiliation. Charlotte Briggs wasn't just a victim of these customs, she was a witness to a deeply engineered culture of submission. And it followed a chilling rhythm. Arbitrary rules. Impossibly high standards. Punishment. Repeat. Dozens of employees kept their heads down. And when they left, most stayed silent, not because they wanted to protect Andrew's reputation, but because that's what the system demanded. Silence was safer. But Charlotte chose to speak up. Years later, after the prince fell from grace on a much more public stage, she stood among those refusing to let the truth be buried. And when she did, she unearthed not just abusive stories from a royal bedroom, but a childhood history that foreshadowed everything she and others would endure. Because Andrew didn't become this man. According to insiders, he always was. Even as a young boy, staff reportedly noticed something off. Where other royal children toyed with curiosity or shyness, Andrew displayed cruelty. Not the energetic chaos of childhood, but a detached, calculated desire to dominate. While Charles read books and Anne challenged expectations, Andrew taunted guards randomly, laughed at servants' discomfort, and physically tormented animals for amusement. Royal protection often prevented these stories from seeing daylight. But they were there. Behind the palace's century-old brick walls, behind the Queen's public smiles, there stood a boy who believed rules didn't apply to him because in many ways they didn't. Accounts surfaced about him mocking the Queen's guards, pulling faces, spitting insults, all for the satisfaction of watching them flinch. Staff later recounted incidents where he intentionally hurt dogs and horses, actions so cruel that in one notorious instance the grooms of the palace punished him in the only way they could get away with, by tossing him into a pile of manure. But even then no real consequences followed. There were no interventions, no behavioral correction. That's the danger of untouchable power, it forgives too much, too often, too soon. One palace footman, after enduring endless verbal abuse from the young Andrew, finally snapped and hit him. It left a black eye. The incident, shocking as it was, should have ended poorly for the man. But even Queen Elizabeth refused to accept his resignation, reportedly understanding that her son had gone too far, even by royal standards. That moment, like many others, was swept quietly under the rug. Royal image must be preserved. And young Andrew learned the lesson: he could cross any line and someone would always clean the stains afterward. Now think about what this teaches a child. That your actions don't have consequences. That your victims are disposable. That titles aren't just power, they're immunity. These lessons didn't die in teenage rebellion. They matured with him into adulthood, maturing into a pattern of entitlement and inflicted suffering that would haunt generations of palace staff and eventually spill out onto the world stage. Charlotte Briggs didn't have access to Andrew's entire life story, of course. She met him much later, but everything she experienced fit into that wider context like puzzle pieces finally falling into place. She didn't meet a misunderstood man twisted by pressure. She met a fully formed tyrant in a suit whose entire existence had been built on conquest through control and kindness seen as weakness. Where most people are forced to change by struggle, Andrew had never been forced to change at all, and the result? A man who saw tenderness as an opportunity for dominance, loyalty as an invitation to abuse, and those who served him not as human beings but as objects to be arranged, judged, and discarded. By now you're wondering, how could such behavior go unchecked for so long? How could one man wreak emotional havoc for decades while smiling during public ceremonies and waving politely from balcony rails? The answer lies not only in Andrew but in the palaces that protected him. The British royal family is an institution built not just on bloodlines and tradition but on control of the narrative, of perception, and most ruthlessly, of skin. For decades every whisper of misconduct within the palace walls was drowned by the ticking of the royal clock. Silence wasn't just protocol, it was protection. But what happens when that shield is no longer strong enough to hold back the truth? What happens when decades of silence are pierced by voices brave enough to speak? By the late 1990s, the cracks in Prince Andrew's royal facade were no longer whispers, they were widening fractures. The same man who once berated maids over curtain folds and teddy bear placement was now making headlines for entirely new reasons. No longer safely hidden behind royal gates, his behavior spilled into the public domain. And unlike before, where palace aides might have intercepted stories before they reached the press, now cameras caught what the staff had been enduring in private for years: arrogance, entitlement, and open disrespect. His scandals had evolved. No longer satisfied with tormenting the staff beneath his roof, Andrew expanded his playground using his name, title, and influence to gain access to circles of wealth, partying, and power outside royal oversight. In public he played the polished diplomat, acting as Britain's trade envoy. In reality he was amassing a new kind of infamy, boarding private jets, partying with questionable billionaires, and treating official trips like holidays bankrolled by taxpayers. That's when the world coined a new nickname, Air Miles Andy, a jab at his obsession with luxury aviation. Instead of traveling for duty, he racked up trips for indulgence. Staff members admitted that arranging his constant demands became a logistical nightmare. Private aircraft requested instead of commercial planes, hotel suites modified at the last second, and always the disregard for those around him. Waiters, drivers, coordinators, they were nothing to him. Service was expected, but appreciation was never given. The palace tried to handle the damage quietly. Statements were drafted, PR teams rejigged the narrative, and the Queen's aura was used like a fire blanket, smothering trouble before it reached combustion. But there's a problem with repeatedly shielding someone from consequences. It teaches them they're indestructible. And Andrew acted as though he was. Even as rumors churned, he never hesitated. As relationships fizzled, such as his awkward extended cohabitation with Sarah Ferguson, his proximity to danger only grew. While Charles attempted to remake his public image after the death of Princess Diana, and while William and Harry were doing charity work or military training, Andrew seemed determined to lean in the opposite direction, to double down on the bad press, to flaunt his disregard for accountability. But the most devastating mistake he made was in the company he kept. Because in the early 2000s, Prince Andrew formed a public, undeniable, astonishing friendship with a man whose name would go on to haunt international headlines, Jeffrey Epstein. Where other men in Epstein's orbit distanced themselves as rumors began to pile up, Andrew remained close, photographed with him in New York, seen visiting his mansion even after Epstein's prison sentence, calling him a loyal friend when questioned. It wasn't guilt by association, it was guilt by ignorance, arrogance, and bold-faced indifference to the lives Epstein had shattered. And when the world turned its rage toward Epstein and his elite network of enablers, Andrew could no longer hide behind press statements or royal protocol. Suddenly, those teddy bear tantrums and outbursts over bedtime pajamas weren't eccentric anymore. They looked like dark signals. Signals of a man used to domination, to silence, to getting everything he wanted, without exception. Charlotte Briggs, who had suffered through his rage behind palace drapes, wasn't surprised. When others shook their heads, wondering how a prince could have fallen so low, she already knew he hadn't fallen. He had always been like this. The difference was now the world could finally see it. When Virginia Giuffre's accusations surfaced, when she bravely named Prince Andrew as one of the men Epstein trafficked her to, shock rippled through the global press. But for palace staff past and present, the allegations felt like a chilling confirmation. Not that Andrew had made one terrible decision, but that this was the natural trajectory of a life lived without boundaries, without empathy, without ever learning the one thing royalty is supposed to lead with: responsibility. Still, some defenders insisted once royal, always protected. They thought, wrongly, that Andrew would find his way back into favor, that a well-worded interview or legal technicality would clean the stains. But they underestimated something powerful: truth. In the age of social media and survivor testimonies, the palace's old power to bury stories was no longer absolute. And as the walls of protection crumbled, the stories hidden away in castles, country houses, and servants' quarters began to pour out. Not from tabloids hunting sensation, but from people who had carried his abuse in silence, and had finally had enough. Now stripped of his military titles, shamed in front of the public that once cheered him, and erased from the prestigious family photo ops that once gave him pride, Prince Andrew stands exactly where he made so many others stand: in isolation, unsupported, and exposed. When Prince Andrew finally sat down for the now infamous BBC Newsnight interview in 2019, it was billed as his chance to set the record straight, to clear the name that had been dragged through headlines, to calmly deny the unfounded accusations, and restore some thread of dignity. But what happened in that interview wasn't a redemption arc, it was a train wreck televised for the world to witness. And for many watching, it confirmed what Charlotte Briggs and countless former royal staff had long implied in private rooms. Andrew wasn't just arrogant, he was hopelessly detached from reality. From the moment the cameras started rolling, things unraveled. No lawyers, no advisors flanking him. Just Andrew sitting across from journalist Emily Maples, exuding a mix of smug confidence and weird misplaced self-assurance. When speaking of Virginia Giuffre's claims, he didn't express empathy or concern. He didn't say, "I am horrified if this woman went through that." What he did was attempt to punch holes in her credibility, with the bizarre grace of a man who had never once faced real interrogation. There were two moments that will stick in public memory forever. First, when he claimed that on the night Virginia left, they danced together at a London nightclub. He was instead at a Pizza Express in Woking with his daughter, a detail so oddly specific, so painfully mundane, that it sounded like parody. The second, when he denied her account of him sweating profusely by declaring he had a rare condition at the time that made him unable to sweat. That was his rebuttal. Not remorseful truth, not a moment of humanity. Instead, his defense was built from fragments so absurd, it left jaws on the floor, not in shock but laughter. Social media exploded. Memes flooded the timelines. What was supposed to be a measured, clarifying interview turned into one of the most humiliating public spectacles the royal family had ever seen. But the damage didn't stop with the optics. This wasn't just a bad PR moment. It was a public unmasking of a man so used to privilege that he believed charm, contradiction, and a sprinkle of royal distance could fix what was unfixable. It didn't. Within days, Andrew was suspended from public duties for the foreseeable future. Charities dropped him. Patronages dissolved. Military titles were returned with silence, not ceremony. And perhaps most notably, Buckingham Palace issued no clarifying pushback, no press statement suggesting this was all a misunderstanding. The Queen, who had shielded her son for decades, stepped back. For the first time in his adult life, Prince Andrew was on his own. But it wasn't just the institution turning its back, it was the British people. The public grew increasingly enraged not just by the Epstein connection or the Giuffre case, but by the pattern of behavior that finally had a light shone upon it. No one could unsee the arrogance, the callousness, the royal detachment from consequences. Inside palace walls, more stories began to surface. Now that Andrew was no longer protected by his HRH title or patronage status, those still close to the inner workings of the monarchy felt safer speaking anonymously.
New anecdotes made headlines about the shoelaces that had to be pressed flat by staff with an iron, about the piles of dirty clothes Andrew would leave scattered like a teenager, about how he once yelled at a staff member because the bathwater was not the exact temperature measured, absurdly, with a thermometer. These details might sound silly when taken individually, but stack them, one after another, and it forms a picture far more disturbing, one of control, dehumanization, and narcissism. It's not about shoelaces or bathwater, it's about a man raised to believe that power exists solely to enforce his comfort, and that those who resist even slightly deserve punishment. Charlotte Briggs watched these events unfold with grim clarity. She said it plainly, Andrew wasn't suffering from a fall. He was simply slipping out from behind the curtain where he had always been vile, and now the world could finally see for itself. In fact, after the interview aired, someone from her former service circle joked, he finally treated the public the way he's always treated staff. It was a brutal line, but it was true. For decades, Andrew's outward signs of royal behavior, suits, medals, salutes, handshakes, served as a mask for compulsive vanity, outbursts, and ego-driven rage behind closed doors. And now, the mask was off, for everyone. And yet even now, there are those who ask, should the prince be forgiven? Hasn't he suffered enough? After all, he's lost his patronages, his titles, his royal duties. He's no longer standing at the balcony perches during national celebrations. Isn't this punishment enough? But ask the staff, ask the maids who cried in silence behind palace corridors, the valets who endured layers of verbal abuse, the anonymous voices who were told to smile through it all for the good of the crown. Ask Charlotte Briggs, who thought she'd be stepping into a dream, only to serve in a house that ran on whispered torment and silent dread. What Prince Andrew lost might seem heavy to those measuring his fall in titles, but what he cost others over years, over decades, that's a weight only his victims can truly calculate. By 2022, any illusion that Prince Andrew would somehow return to public life had disintegrated completely. The royal family, ever cautious about headlines and legacy, moved quietly, but decisively to distance themselves from the man once considered the Queen's favorite son, and behind every withdrawn invitation, every revoked honorary military title, lay something deeper than just politics or pride was survival of the institution. In order to preserve the monarchy, they had. Andrew's name was no longer spoken at royal events beyond the bare minimum. When Queen Elizabeth passed in 2022, and Charles ascended the throne, one of his first symbolic moves was final, stripping his younger brother of the remnants of royal life. There would be no comeback, no redemption arc wrapped in nostalgia, or even sympathy. Andrew wasn't merely sidelined, he was erased from the front line of monarchy. The message was clear, even if the palace was too proud to say it out loud. We no longer protect him. But that didn't stop the stories from spreading. In fact, Andrew's exile only seemed to embolden former palace workers to come forward, people who had once stayed silent, not because they were afraid of him, but because they were afraid of the crown. With Andrew's image tarnished beyond restoration, their truths no longer carried the same risk of retaliation. New statements described his outbursts in even greater detail, the door slamming, the obscenities, the terrifying unpredictability of mood swings over trivial frustrations. Drivers spoke of being yelled at for arriving 3 minutes late. Gardeners recalled being berated for leaves not being blown into the right direction. One even noted Andrew hated the sound of certain birds, and would demand staff do something about it, as if the natural world too should bend to his preferences. But none of these actions happened in pure isolation. They were always part of a larger framework, an invisible palace machine built to endure abuse in silence. The maids didn't complain. The butlers kept their gloves on. The valets smiled politely, because suffering, in royal quarters, was expected to be part of the job. Charlotte Briggs summed it up in one brutal sentence: I wasn't a worker, I was a punching bag with a name tag. None of this made it to the glossy interviews or anniversary specials, but it existed in private break rooms, in diary pages never published, in whispered warnings from departing staff to those just beginning their service. Evening instructions ended not with good night, but with be careful around the Duke. And yet even after all that, even after settlements, and exiles, and removal from royal engagements, there are people, some loyalists, some sympathizers, who still call his accusers liars, who ask where's the proof, as if psychological scars leave physical receipts. but proof exists in patterns, in eyewitnesses, in memorized routines of staff who could recite Andrew's demands as if they were ceremonial prayers, in entire careers unfolding under the shadow of his entitlement. In early 2022, the lawsuit filed by Virginia Giuffre reached its boiling point. The palace had remained silent, clearly hoping the legal process would somehow evaporate before it forced too much disruption. But when a U.S. judge ruled the case could proceed to trial, silence became impossibility. Suddenly the possibility of the Queen's son testifying under oath about flying on Epstein's jet, about partying in the Caribbean, became real. And just like that, it ended not with a court battle or a dramatic televised cross-examination, but with a settlement. Prince Andrew paid a reported £12 million, not to silence the truth, but to escape it. They called it no admission of guilt in the paperwork, but the public was not interested in paperwork. They saw what it meant and what it didn't. If you were innocent, why settle? If the photo wasn't real, why hide? If the pain was fake, why pay? Answers never came. Only silence, muted palace curtains, and more distance between the public and a man once positioned only a few heartbeats away from extreme power. At the funeral of Queen Elizabeth, Andrew stood among his siblings, but no longer one of them. Not really. He wore no uniform, he gave no command. His once polished presence was now ghost-like, a figure that everyone recognized, yet no one acknowledged. Even Prince Harry, himself embroiled in tensions with the crown, seemed more at peace with the crowd than Andrew, because scandal has tears, and Andrew had reached the lowest one. When the coronation of King Charles III eventually arrived, Andrew's role was as symbolic as his title empty. No robes, no speeches, no place of pride. Cameras zoomed in like vultures, not because they admired him, but because they fed on the spectacle of a disgraced prince, mercifully quiet, awkwardly included, but undeniably rejected. To some this may seem like the punishment fitting the crime, a man stripped of privilege, of position, of reputation. But to those like Charlotte, who cleaned his messes, absorbed his screams, managed his obsessions, and endured psychological wounds that never needed to happen, it wasn't justice, it was delayed consequence. And even then, one question keeps echoing for those who followed the story from inside the walls. How much more would he have gotten away with if no one had ever spoken? There's a quiet kind of courage in telling the truth about powerful people. Not the kind that earns medals or gets photographed, but the kind that shatters glass from the inside out. When Charlotte Briggs spoke out, she did more than accuse a prince's, she disrupted an illusion. For decades, the public was fed an image of Prince Andrew as a royal charming enough to make headlines, but harmless enough to ignore. That changed the moment a woman he barely remembered described exactly what it was like to be invisible under his gaze. The truth didn't arrive with trumpets and headlines, it came wrapped in the words of a former maid, describing 5 a.m. mornings spent in sheer panic, because a curtain hadn't been closed precisely. It showed up in stories about pressed shoelaces, folded pajama pants positioned to mathematical precision, and toys arranged like soldiers in a private shrine to his broken ego. They weren't funny tales of eccentricity, they were symptoms. What the palace once dismissed as quirks became road signs pointing toward a dangerous pattern. Andrew didn't simply act entitled because he was royalty. He acted cruelly because cruelty had always worked for him. He had been protected, coddled, enabled, and excused from the moment he first threw a tantrum in a golden cradle. Parents, staff, media, even the monarchy itself, all combined to create a man convinced he was untouchable. But what Andrew never counted on were the voices growing louder. The staff, once silent, began echoing across time and titles. One said being around him felt like breathing broken glass. Another recalled walking backwards out of rooms, terrified their job and dignity depended on staying unseen. These weren't rebels, they were survivors, and their silence wasn't weakness, it was survival, until finally, it wasn't.